Today's story is about a man and his quest for the perfect photo. He would eventually get it, but it would cost him dearly. We will show you his picture at the end of today's video. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to buy the like button a brand new set of AirPods, but just give them regular earbuds with the cords cut off. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Saturday, April 25th, 1987 was a beautiful spring day in the mountains of northwest Montana. It was exactly the kind of day that 40-year-old Charles Gibbs and his wife Glenda had been waiting for months. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the breeze was warm. And so, at around 9 a.m. that morning, Charles and Glenda had a quick breakfast inside of their house in the rural city of Libby, and then they started stuffing their backpacks full of their hiking equipment. Charles and Glenda were going to go to Glacier National Park, which is a 1 million acre wilderness preserve with alpine meadows, forests, rivers, and lakes that are so bright and crystal blue, they almost look like they're glowing. The park is ringed by snow-covered mountains, and it's dotted with glaciers, which are huge masses of pure ice that jut up out of the rock and make you feel like you've stumbled onto some ancient frozen planet. The park is actually so otherworldly that when Hollywood producers were looking for a location to shoot the heaven scene in the big movie What Dreams May Come, they chose Glacier National Park as their location. And for Charles and Glenda, this place practically was heaven. It was the place they went all the time to go hiking, especially on beautiful sunny spring days. After packing all of their gear, Charles and Glenda made their way out the front door and began heading to their car, when as they were walking, Charles suddenly stopped short, shook his head, turned around, and ran back inside the house. When he came back out again, he was carrying his camera bag, and so he ran over to the car, he sat down in the driver's seat, and he grinned at his wife, and he held up the bag, and he said, "Now we're ready." Both Charles and Glenda worked for the public schools in Libby. Glenda was an elementary school teacher, and Charles drove a school bus. But like a lot of people who lived in Montana, their real passion was the outdoors. And for Charles specifically, his real passion was wildlife photography. He was actually a pretty accomplished amateur photographer. He'd had a couple of photo exhibits locally, and he'd gotten a few of his pictures published in the local newspaper. But what Charles really wanted to do with his photography was get one of his wildlife pictures published in a weekly publication called the Hungry Horse News. The Hungry Horse News was a tiny publication, but they had won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest award for American journalism. And the Hungry Horse News was famous for its nature photography. Charles had been submitting his work for years to the Hungry Horse News, but the editor kept rejecting them, telling Charles that his photos were totally beautiful, but they weren't dynamic enough. Nothing was happening in these photos. And so, that morning, on the couple's drive to Glacier National Park, Charles began talking out loud to Glenda about what strategy he was going to use for his photographs during their hike. You know, what route they were going to be on, and what was the best angle to take certain pictures. And as Glenda listened to Charles, she just smiled to herself, because it was like no matter how many times Charles got shot down by the Hungry Horse News, she knew he was never going to give up. And so she loved his determination and just unflappable attitude about his craft. At around 11 a.m., Charles and Glenda pulled off the highway and began heading towards the trailhead where they would start their hike that day, which was located at the base of Elk Mountain on the southern border of the park. The route they had chosen for that day was not one of the most popular at the park, and the reason for that was the trail was really steep, and in certain parts of it was fairly overgrown, and so really only the most hardcore hikers would go up this trail, of which there weren't that many. And so Charles and Glenda were used to being on this trail and seeing no one. But they preferred it that way. They loved being alone out in nature. Finally, they reached the gravel parking lot right at the trailhead, and Charles parked their car, and then he and Glenda hopped out. They grabbed their bags and then began walking on this trail. The first mile of this trail brought the couple out along an abandoned road and then over some railroad tracks and then out into this beautiful field full of white flowers. And then the trail really started to get difficult because it basically went straight up the side of a mountain. And as they walked up this really steep part of the trail, Charles was nonstop taking pictures of everything he saw. There were deer and mountain goats, and at some point the couple reached a clearing on this steep section where they could look down and see a lake, and they saw there were beavers hard at work building a dam. And so of course, Charles got a picture of that too. Now, these were the days before digital photography, and so all these pictures that Charles was taking, he couldn't actually see. He needed to go home and develop the film to see if anything he took was worth keeping. But as Charles and Glenda continued their hike up this mountain, Charles was getting more and more excited about some of the shots he was getting. He felt like they were going to be really, really good, and Hungry Horse News was going to finally accept his work. The couple made it to the summit of this trail by early afternoon, and from up there, they had this beautiful panoramic view of all these jagged mountaintops that were covered in snow, separated by these huge valleys and prairies, and Charles and Glenda were the only ones up there, and so they had this unbelievable view all to themselves. And so the couple would eat the lunch that they brought with them while sitting on this rocky outcropping, kind of looking out over this stunning view. And then when they were done, they packed up their stuff and began heading back down because they knew they wanted to get off of this trail and out of the park before sundown. It was just about 5 p.m. when Charles and Glenda had reached the final slope of this steep section of the trail, and they were getting closer and closer to that big open field with the white flowers. And as they're going down this last section of steepness, Charles suddenly grabs Glenda and stops her and puts his fingers to his lips and then turns around and points behind him. Charles was visibly excited about whatever he was pointing at, but when Glenda looked in the direction he was pointing, she couldn't see anything, but she obviously knew that whatever he was pointing at, Charles wanted to take a picture of it. Now, Glenda by this point was really tired from the hiking and just wanted to go back to the car and go home. I mean, after all, Charles had taken dozens and dozens of pictures that day. Like, we don't need to get one more. And so Glenda would look at Charles impatiently, basically suggesting, like, come on, we can come back another time. But Charles didn't budge, and he looked at her like, please, I want to get one more photo. And so Glenda kind of did one of these and was like, okay. And Charles said, thank you, I'll meet you at the car. And so Glenda stood there and watched as her husband got his camera out, turned around, and began slowly making his way back up the trail. And again, Glenda's looking. She can't see what he's going to take a picture of, but she figured, he had his plan. And Glenda, she turned around and began heading back down towards the car. It didn't take long for Glenda to get back to the car. She got there right around 6 p.m. And when she got there, she hopped inside, sat in the front passenger seat, turned on the radio, and then she expected to have to wait for maybe another 20 minutes or so for Charles to finish up and come join her. But Glenda, after sitting in the car, was so tired that she accidentally fell asleep. And when she woke up again, she was kind of disoriented, and immediately she looked to see if her husband was in the car with her, and he wasn't. And she's looking outside, it's getting pretty dark out. She glanced at her watch, it was 7 p.m., which means Charles had left her for at least an hour by this point. And she's thinking, there's no way Charles would have been gone for an hour. He would never do that. He would never leave me alone like that. And so Glenda began glancing around her, kind of half expecting to see Charles just outside of their car, doing something, but she was all alone. There was no other hikers or cars. Charles wasn't there. And so starting to panic, Glenda got out of her car and began hustling back onto the trail to go look for Charles. And so she's yelling for Charles, she's looking around, it's getting darker and darker, and there's no sign of Charles. He's not calling back to her, it's just totally silent. She walks along the abandoned road, she reaches the railroad tracks, she gets into that meadow with the white flowers, and still there's no sign of Charles. And she gets to the base of that steep section of the trail, and she's looking up at all these trees and how dark it was getting, and she's thinking to herself, if Charles is in trouble somewhere up there, there's no way I can help him by myself in the dark with no equipment. No one knows I'm here. I mean, this is an emergency and I need help. And so Glenda would scream a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing any response, she turned and ran all the way back to her car. She turned it on and she drove to the nearest ranger station. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I was younger, there were several people I was very close with who struggled mightily with depression, and it was very difficult to watch because all I wanted to do was help them, but the reality is it's the person who is struggling who needs to go out and get help in order to get better. You can't just magically make them feel better. And so because of this experience in my youth, by the time I was an adult, I was very adept at talking about my feelings to anyone who would listen because I was concerned if I didn't share, I might start bottling things up and then I would get depressed. However, it's really easy to talk openly about your feelings when your feelings are good and you feel okay. But when you feel really bad and sad and depressed, it's nearly impossible to tell people about how you feel. And so in 2017, when I started having really dark thoughts for the first time in my entire life, suddenly I was not able to tell people about it. Luckily, my family encouraged me to seek out professional help, and I did see a therapist, and ultimately, I really think that saved my life. So if you're struggling right now but feel like you can't talk to anyone about how you're feeling, consider giving BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then you can talk to them however you feel most comfortable, whether it's through text, chat, video call, phone call, or some combination. And at any time, if you want to switch your therapist, it's easy and free to do so. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also left a link in the description. When she got there, she ran inside and immediately told the ranger where her and Charles had been, which trail they were on, and where roughly they were on this trail when she had gone to the car and Charles had turned around and gone uphill to take a picture of something. And as Glenda told the ranger all these details about where they were inside of the park, he really started to look worried. And when Glenda was done explaining, he told her that, yes, we need to go right now and look for your husband, but I can't have you on that trail. It's too dangerous. And so this ranger had Glenda wait at the ranger station, and the ranger, by himself, headed back to the trailhead to go looking for Charles. And so the ranger, he gets to the trailhead, he hops out, he's got a rifle and a flashlight, and he begins walking along this trail, and by now, it's dark out. And so he's looking straight ahead with his flashlight and scanning side to side. He's calling out for Charles, and he's walking this trail. He gets all the way across the train tracks, through the meadow, and he gets to the steep section, and he actually begins going up this part of the trail until roughly the area where Glenda had described Charles going one way and her going back down. And when he got there, there was no sign of Charles, and so the ranger just took his rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, hoping that that might get Charles, if he was in the area, to hear him and call out or do something to indicate where he had gone. But after firing his gun, the ranger heard nothing. By this point, it was approaching midnight, it was totally pitch black outside, and the ranger knew that at this point, Charles was missing, and they really needed to organize a true search party to try to find him. But they would have to do that the next morning when they had light again. And so the ranger called out a few more times for Charles, and after not hearing anything, he reluctantly turned around and made his way back to his truck and drove back to the ranger station, where he would tell Glenda that he could not find her husband and they would now have to wait for sunrise. At sunrise the next morning, 20 searchers arrived at the trailhead where Charles and Glenda had been, and these searchers had dogs, and all the dogs had Charles's scent from some clothes that was in Glenda's car. And so this big search team very slowly and methodically began moving down this trail. And so they went across the abandoned road, over the train tracks, through the meadow with the white flowers. They got to the steep section of the trail, and they got all the way up to that point where Charles and Glenda had separated, and Charles had gone uphill to do whatever he was going to do. And it was at that point on the steep section that one of the searchers' dogs picked up Charles's scent and took off running uphill. And the searcher, whose dog this was, took off running after the dog, and the dog, it went up for a little while, up the steep rocky outcropping, and then it turned and began going down again until it reached a different meadow, so not the same one they walked through with the white flowers. This was farther away to the right, and in this meadow, the dog, who still very much had the scent, began to slow down, and it went straight for this tree. It was kind of a standalone tree right at the base of this steep section, and this tree had had low-hanging branches, maybe 5 feet off the ground, and the dog went right up to the tree, and then it stopped for a second, and the searcher by this point had caught up to the dog, and so he's looking at this tree, and he sees the ground looks really disturbed, and there's deep gouges in this tree, and then the dog went around this tree and sprinted another 50 feet or so, and then stopped, like it had found something. And when the searcher caught up to his dog, he looked down and he found what they feared the most. It was Charles, and he was deceased. His body was totally mangled, his arms and legs were eaten away, there were deep cuts and gouges all over his body, and there was a blood trail from Charles all the way back to this tree. Also, just a few feet from Charles's outstretched hand was a camera, Charles's camera. Now, it was obvious that something horrific had happened to Charles, and there were clear signs of a struggle that took place near this tree, and then also over here where he was found, there were clear marks on the ground that there was some sort of fight that happened right here. But interestingly, Charles was carrying a gun, but it appeared that he did not unholster it and he didn't fire it. Instead, it almost looked like whatever was happening to Charles, he refused to put his camera down, which is why it was so close to his hand when he finally died. And so it was decided that the only way to determine what happened to Charles would be to develop his camera, to figure out what he was taking pictures of before he died. And so authorities would send off Charles's camera roll to be developed, and 2 weeks later, when they got it back, they couldn't believe what they saw. The photos very clearly told the story of what happened to Charles. This is what happened after Charles left his wife on that trail. When Charles stopped his wife and signaled to her that he wanted to take one more picture up the trail, he had found a photographic opportunity of a lifetime. The warm spring weather that had drawn Charles and Glenda out of their house to Glacier National Park had also woken the grizzly bears in the park from their hibernation. And what Charles had seen up the trail was a mother grizzly bear and her 3 cubs. The first few photographs that Charles would take of these bears were shot from a good distance away, and it just showed the mother bear and her 3 babies just kind of sauntering around the rocks, not really paying any attention to Charles. To Charles, grizzly bears were the most majestic creatures in nature. He didn't just love them, he viewed them as if they were sort of magical in some way. He was always going to local town meetings to speak about grizzly bears' beauty, and we needed to defend their natural habitat. As such, anyone who knew Charles knew about his passion for grizzlies. And while of course Charles knew that grizzly bears were dangerous, he also thought that the bears, who were very smart and sensitive, could sense his own very gentle and protective feelings towards them, and so if he was around them, they would never perceive him as a threat. Charles had taken some very good photos of other bears, black bears, but he had never taken what he called the definitive grizzly bear photo. And it was going to be this definitive grizzly photo of the mother and her 3 cubs that would finally get him a spot in the Hungry Horse News publication. As Charles took more and more photos of these bears, you could see in the photos that Charles was getting closer and closer and closer to this mother bear and her cubs. It was obvious that he was tracking them, even as the mother bear and the cubs were clearly trying to walk away from him. Finally, when Charles got about 50 feet away from this family of grizzly bears, he must have kicked a rock or stepped on a twig that broke that startled the bears. And so the second to last photo that Charles would take of this family shows the mother bear very clearly turning around to look at Charles, and she's making perfect eye contact with him, as is one of her cubs. Charles would take one more photo, and in this photo you can see the bears are not just staring at Charles, they are running towards him, they are charging him. And it was likely after taking this photo that Charles realized the danger he was in. At this point, Charles tried to make a run for it by running down the side of this mountain. He got down to that tree with the low-hanging limbs, and he attempted to climb up into it, maybe hoping he could get one more picture of this bear if they would just leave him alone. But the mother bear and her cubs, they came charging down. They saw him up in the tree, and the mother bear began climbing into the tree, and she reached Charles. Now, she likely weighed about 400 pounds, and when mother grizzly bears are defending their young, they are absolutely merciless. and so she must have grabbed him or bit onto him and yanked him from the tree. And Charles somehow, after being pulled to the ground and getting slashed and bit by this bear, he managed to break away from her, as we can tell from the blood trail, and he made it about 50 feet away from this tree before the bear chased him down again, jumped on top of him, and killed him. When authorities figured out that Charles had managed to briefly get away from this mother grizzly bear and made it 50 feet away from her, they wondered why he hadn't pulled out his gun and shot at the bears to defend himself. But Charles's wife, Glenda, said it made perfect sense that Charles had not tried to harm this grizzly bear or her cubs. He loved grizzly bears, and he would never dream of leaving these 3 cubs without their mother. After Charles's death, the rangers did not attempt to track down this bear and her cubs and do anything to the bears, because they felt like the bears were just acting like bears and it was Charles who was in the wrong. And Charles's family and friends would say that is a decision that Charles would definitely support. Charles's photos of the grizzly bear family were published in the Hungry Horse News alongside an article about his death. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast. We have over 100 episodes. Many of them are exclusive to the podcast, so you can't get them on YouTube. The podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Today's story covers one of the strangest and most hotly debated mysteries on the internet. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to help the like button pack up all their things so they can move, but only use old and weak tape so the bottom of the moving boxes fall out as soon as anyone tries to lift them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well. And it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, mom, I have a lot to talk to you about. And until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead she put her husband on the phone and he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? Your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought, we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him, and let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away, and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop, and he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You got to talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally, his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol. There was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic, and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just gotta drive home. You gotta leave Buttonwillow. You gotta come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back, and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no, after you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot, but the police actually were just over there. They checked on him, and now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. This is the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, "Hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home." And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, "Okay, yeah, all right, let's leave." And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back, and he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, "Okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home." But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, "Come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you," Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, "Okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road." So Bryce says, "No problem, I'll do that." And they hang up. Several hours later at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived. Thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, "Do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car?" And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, "Yes, our son Bryce drives that car." The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. I mean, they looked everywhere for days and days and days. but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop, and then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th.
Today, we're going to look at 3 stories about real people who at some point in their lives made choices. Now, at the time, these choices were fairly innocuous, but eventually those choices would completely change not only their lives, but millions of other people's lives as well. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the like button's phone and change the names of all their contacts to just say spam, so that every call they get, they think it's spam and they don't answer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On January 17, 1977, a 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore walked towards an abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. Gary was surrounded on all sides by guards because they were afraid that Gary might try to run and not go inside of this factory. But Gary was not about to run. He'd been waiting for months for this, and he was ready. So Gary, along with the guards at his sides, made their way towards the factory, and then without any hesitation, Gary stepped inside. And what he saw was this big, cavernous, open space with no equipment in it, nothing. It was just basically this massive empty space, and one chair pushed up against the far back wall. Gary knew he was supposed to sit in that chair. So without even being told, he just began walking across the floor towards it. And then when he reached the chair, he sat down. And once Gary was sitting, the guards that had walked him in began strapping his wrists and his ankles to this chair so he couldn't move. And as they did this, Gary didn't put up a fight. He just sat there staring straight across to the other side of this factory. And on the far side of this factory was one other thing inside of this space. It was like this big curtain, like somebody had wheeled out like this massive curtain that was protecting something on the other side. And as he was staring at this curtain that was sort of perpendicular to him, he saw there were 5 evenly spaced cutouts across the curtain. And even though Gary couldn't actually see anything in any of these cutouts, he knew what was behind them. He knew that at each station, there was a police officer armed with a rifle. They were the firing squad that Gary himself had requested. So Gary was a convicted murderer, and he had been sentenced to death just a few months earlier. His death sentence had gotten a lot of media coverage, And immediately after the sentencing, his mother, along with the American Civil Liberties Union, had lobbied to try to change the sentence and make it a life sentence instead. But while Gary appreciated their efforts, he actually did not want that. He did not want, to spend the rest of his life in prison. That was the only alternative to the death sentence, is life without parole. And that sounded horrible. And so instead, he had basically pushed to go forward with his execution, and he was very specific about how he wanted to die. He wanted to die by firing squad, and that had been granted to him. And so after the guards had finished strapping Gary into the chair, they backed off, and then the chaplain came over and read Gary his last rites. And then after that, he asked Gary if he had anything else he wanted to say. And Gary looked up at the chaplain and just said, "Let's do it." And so the chaplain backed off, signaled to the firing squad that Gary was ready, and then once everything was in place, rifles poked through the 5 holes in the curtain, and they fired. Shortly after, Gary was dead. 10 years after Gary's execution in 1987, a young marketing executive named Dan Wyden was having a meeting with his colleagues at his company's headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So Dan actually owned this marketing agency, and his company had recently signed this new client. It was a small business with a lot of promise who was hopefully looking to expand, and they were leaning on Dan and his team to help them do that. And while Dan certainly believed that this company had the chance to be huge, he just felt like they lacked something. They needed a strong marketing campaign to really get them off the ground and sort of begin to make them a household name. And so this meeting that Dan was having right now with his colleagues was their attempts at coming up with, what can we do? What kind of campaign can we run for this company? And so for hours, they sat there pitching different ideas, different concepts of how we can elevate this brand. But it was like, even though a lot of ideas seemed promising, nothing really felt right. Everything just sort of felt like, maybe that would help. There was no slam dunk idea, at least not yet. And so as Dan is beginning to get frustrated, realizing he really doesn't have any great ideas yet, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, Dan does not understand why he had this epiphany. He had not been thinking about this information until it just popped into his head. Instead, this idea really just kind of suddenly came to him. As he's sitting there with his colleagues, feeling frustrated, not knowing what to do, he just randomly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore 10 years earlier, death by firing squad. It was all over the news. And Dan, like his colleagues, had certainly kept up with that story. It was a big deal at the time. And as Dan is sitting there just thinking about that execution, he remembered a very particular detail about the execution that for whatever reason just felt like, oh my goodness, we can use that to market this brand. Dan would take a well-known detail from the execution of Gary Gilmore, he would tweak it slightly, and he would use it to fuel this advertising campaign for the small business. And it would work amazingly. In fact, this campaign was so successful, it literally doubled this company's business practically overnight. And this campaign, it featured a slogan that has since become arguably one of, if not the most famous slogans for any business in the entire world. The slogan that Dan created as part of this very famous campaign was based directly on Gary Gilmore's final words. Just do it. Dan's client, that small business, was Nike. Last year, we launched a brand new podcast here at Ballen Studios called Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna. And so far, you guys have loved it. And in case you haven't heard, we also launched a YouTube channel for Redacted, where you can not only listen to these episodes, but also watch the beautiful animations we've done for each of these episodes. That channel already has 150,000 subscribers, and it's growing really quickly, and there are hours of content available right now for you to binge. New uploads to this YouTube channel will be every single Tuesday. All you have to do is look up @Redacted Mysteries on YouTube, and I'll also be putting a link in the description below. Wondery Plus subscribers can also watch Redacted on the Wondery app. Okay, back to the stories. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do. And so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, is this okay? And she kind of looked back and smiled like, I get it, it's fine, we can eat here. So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table. And then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here. And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, sure, go ahead. And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, Chris, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't, and so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something? And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, what's going on? Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date, insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig. And at this, Chris is like, I can't just sit here. And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, hey man, get up, like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake, because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy, and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date, and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point, and he kept apologizing to his date, and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there. And so they left the McDonald's and they both, went to their respective homes. And Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning, when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long, he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good, but it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity and he left thinking, I'm not going to get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights, and they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines, he's got the charisma, and look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast, and this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. I mean, he truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones. One night in 1925, a 21-year-old college student named Ted was inside of his dorm room at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, surrounded by his friends. Ted and his friends had gotten their hands on a bottle of gin, and so tonight they were just sitting around, drinking this gin and having a great time. Now, Ted and his friends knew this was not allowed. I mean, literally they knew this was illegal. It didn't matter that they were 21 years old. At the time, in the United States in 1925, the country was in the middle of prohibition, which meant no one was allowed to possess or consume alcohol. It was actually illegal. But Ted specifically was willing to take that risk because tonight he wanted to celebrate. Ted was a senior in college and was getting ready to graduate with honors. And also, he had recently been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine called Jack-O-Lantern. This was a big deal for Ted. I mean, he had aspirations of graduating and becoming a professional writer and publisher, and it just felt like everything was falling into place, getting this job as editor-in-chief. It was a huge accomplishment. So Ted took a swig from the bottle and passed it around the circle, and before long, he and his friends were all pretty drunk and having a great time, laughing and joking and telling stories. It was a lot of fun, but at some point, they heard a knock on their door. And right away, Ted and his friends went silent, remembering that, oh my God, are we in trouble now? Ted said, no, it's fine. I'm sure it's just, more friends coming to stop by and hang out with us. And so Ted, he gets up, he goes to the door, and his heart's racing a little bit because he doesn't know who's there. He opens the door, and it's not friends, it's two police officers. And so Ted and his friends all got busted for drinking alcohol. However, fortunately for them, the police did not press charges, and so nobody went to jail, and also the school, Dartmouth, decided not to expel Ted or any of his friends. However, they were dealt some pretty severe punishments. Specifically, Dartmouth stripped Ted of all of his academic honors and extracurriculars, which meant he was no longer the editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. In fact, he was told by the school that not only was he no longer the editor-in-chief, but he couldn't even submit to put anything in writing into that magazine. He was totally banned. Ted was heartbroken, less so about the academic honors and much more so about being, cut off from the Jack-O-Lantern magazine. He really had attached a lot of value to being the editor-in-chief. He felt like things were going in the direction of him graduating and becoming this professional writer, and so this was sort of a devastating blow. Ted considered fighting with Dartmouth to try to reinstate himself with the magazine, but the more he thought about it, the more he knew that was going nowhere. They were not going to change their mind. However, Ted was not quite ready to just totally give up on this magazine. He knew this magazine did accept submissions from the public, and so he thought, okay, well, I'm not allowed to submit anything to this magazine, but maybe if I come up with a different name, a pen name, then I can submit my work, they won't know it's me, and maybe I can get something published. And so that's exactly what Ted began doing, and the new editor-in-chief of this magazine had no idea this pen name was actually Ted. And so when they received the work from this pseudonym, they thought it was some new person they had never heard of. And they were so wowed by the work, they're like, this is great. And they began publishing all of Ted's work, not realizing it was his. And for Ted, oddly enough, this became in some ways more satisfying than when he was writing under his own name. He kind of liked this pen name. It kind of, fit the vibe of his writing. And so he just continued up with this ruse for the rest of the time he was at Dartmouth, and then after he graduated, He just continued to write under this pen name. Throughout the rest of his life, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books, all under this pen name, a name he came up with basically just because he got caught drinking in the dorm in college. These books would entertain and inspire generations of people, and in fact, he would even win a Pulitzer Prize for his contribution to American literature and education. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but I'm sure you know him much better by his pen name, which is Dr. Seuss. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, MrBallen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to tell you 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is struggling to fall asleep because they're scared, offer to tell them a comforting bedtime story to help them sleep. But tell them Bell's Canyon. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of Tuesday, July 13th, 1993, a middle-aged nurse named Sharon Dempsey hurried down the hallway of the Meharry Hubbard Hospital, which was in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. And as she went down the hallway, Sharon checked in every single hospital room because she was searching for a patient that kept disappearing from her room. When Sharon reached the end of the hallway, she looked into the last room, and there, inside, was the woman she was looking for. Her name was Mildred Lancaster. She was 69 years old, and she was sweeping the floor of another patient's room with a broom that Sharon knew she had taken from the custodian's cart. Sharon walked in, and she politely asked Mildred, what are you doing here? And Mildred turned to her and just said, oh, she was just doing her job. But she wasn't really doing her job. Mildred had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier because she was having stomach pain, but she was also suffering from extreme bouts of confusion. At this, Sharon, the nurse, just sort of sighed and kind of rolled her eyes because, obviously this was not Mildred's job. Mildred was a patient. She had been admitted to the hospital 2 days earlier, primarily because she was having stomach pain, but she also suffered from severe bouts of confusion, which is something she was witnessing right here. Her family had told doctors that, Mildred had spent most of her life being a housekeeper. And so when she would get confused, which, they saw plenty of times, she often would sort of default to thinking that she was back to being a housekeeper, even though, she was home or clearly not working. She would think she was working. And so when Mildred began demonstrating this kind of bizarre, disoriented behavior, there was some consideration to actually just physically restraining Mildred inside of her room to keep her from vanishing and, going and thinking she was a housekeeper somewhere. She could get into trouble or get hurt. However, Mildred was this very sweet and gentle woman who, it was just hard to forcibly restrain inside of her room. And so instead, the medical team decided that we're just gonna have to deal with the fact that periodically she's gonna, think she's at work and it might walk out of her room and go start cleaning somewhere. And so we need to keep a close eye on her and keep her safe and just deal with her stomach pain and sort of manage her disorientation. And so in this moment, Sharon, the nurse, who's just found Mildred once again cleaning some room she was not supposed to be in, she just, followed their protocol and went in and kind of gently told Mildred, like, okay, put the broom down, come with me. And, Mildred listened, and she led Mildred back to her room, and Sharon continued going about her day. A couple of days later, and Sharon was doing her regular rounds through the hospital. And as she did, she went into Mildred's room, and once again, she saw the room was empty. Now, Sharon was actually just kind of annoyed at this point. She wasn't really concerned because by this point, Mildred had done this, had, become disoriented and left to go clean or something so many times by this point that it was just kind of a hassle. But, Sharon just followed protocol and quickly left the room and began walking along the floor looking for Mildred so she could bring her back. But after searching the floor, she didn't find Mildred. And so after checking the whole floor again, but this time much more thoroughly, looking in every closet, every supply area, really searching the area and still not finding her, that's when Sharon began to panic. She began going to other nurses and doctors and asking them, have you seen Mildred? And remember, at this point, the whole floor is aware of what's going on with Mildred, but nobody had seen her, so nobody knew where she was. And so Sharon ultimately went and spoke to the higher-ups at the hospital and informed them what was going on here. And in turn, they launched this huge search all across the hospital, both inside and outside, to just go find Mildred and get her back. And while the search is ongoing, Sharon was walking around trying to be helpful because, she was somebody that worked closely with Mildred and had a sense of where she might go. And she was telling folks to go to messy areas because Mildred, when she would get confused, would basically go clean areas she deemed messy. And so go to parts of the hospital that might look messy. And so people were doing that. But this hospital, it was huge. It was 11 stories tall. And there were lots of areas that appeared messy. And so it just seemed like a kind of overwhelming task to quickly search this massive property for Mildred. And then on top of that, making it even harder to find Mildred was the fact that the hospital didn't have security cameras. So they couldn't just pull up the footage and see if maybe Mildred had walked outside or something. After about an hour of the search going on, when still they had not found Mildred and people were starting to wonder, like, are we even going to find her at all? It was at that point that something new and really concerning happened. Sharon called Mildred's cousin to let her and the rest of Mildred's family know that Mildred was missing and that this time it was actually pretty serious that they hadn't found her. But as Sharon is breaking this news to the cousin stops her and says, well, wait a minute, I think I know what's going on here. Because apparently a few hours earlier, the cousin had gone to the hospital to visit Mildred. And when they got there and spoke to the receptionist looked up Mildred to see what room she was in. And on their system, it showed that Mildred had checked out of the hospital that morning. So she was not there. And so, of course, this big search for Mildred was not going to find her because she wasn't at the hospital. But this really made no sense to Sharon. It did logically make sense that if she checked out, that would explain why she wasn't here. But Mildred should not have been allowed to check out of the hospital. She still definitely was not well. Not just her confusion, but also the stomach pain she was having. Like, she was still totally sick and should not have been discharged. But, the cousin was adamant that they actually left the hospital because they told them, Mildred's not here. There's no one to go visit. She's gone. She checked out. And so Sharon hung up with the cousin and quickly ran down the hall to go talk to the receptionist to see if it was actually true that Mildred had been discharged. And when the receptionist looked it up, sure enough, it was true. Mildred had checked out. And so at this point, Sharon, she could not believe what she was hearing. This didn't make sense. And so Sharon, kind of not knowing what to do next, she walked away from the receptionist and she just walked over to the window that looked out to the front of the hospital. And she was just standing there wondering what she should do. And as she was standing there, she was just looking outside kind of absentmindedly. And she saw all these cars whizzing by, all these busy streets out there. And she suddenly had this thought, like, well, wait a minute, what if Mildred, in her confused state, went to the front desk and somehow talked her way out and got discharged and has now wandered out into the streets? And what if she's gotten hit by a car or something? This could be an emergency. I have to do something. And so Sharon's first thought was, I gotta call the police. And so not long after this, after Sharon did call the authorities, the police arrived at the hospital and they arrived along with search dogs. And one of the search dogs almost immediately picked up Mildred's scent by one of the front doors of the hospital. And then the dog led its handler down the street, which seemed to confirm that Mildred really had left the hospital. And so officers would search a full square mile around the hospital, and they even got a helicopter to begin flying overhead. And the search went on for days. But nobody found Mildred. There was no sign of her. She just disappeared. Until almost 2 weeks later. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. You know that feeling when you know you're about to do something like a bad habit and you just can't stop yourself? You see it happening and you know you're not supposed to, but it's like you can't stop. And eventually, if this continues to happen to you and you don't make a change, you start looking internal and saying, like, what's wrong with me? Even though the reality is there's nothing wrong with you. This is part of being human. When I was in the military, I definitely developed some bad habits. And when I transitioned back to being a civilian in 2017, a lot of those bad habits followed. And I definitely found myself in that cycle of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I stop? Well, let me just tell you, this cycle, these patterns I'm describing, they're not random. The reason this happens is because you have some sort of unresolved issue or issues, and you really need to talk to somebody about it. This is where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp makes it really easy to access credentialed therapists. BetterHelp also accepts both HSA and FSA cards, making it even easier to prioritize your mental health. In 2024 alone, over 137,000 people used their HSA or FSA benefits for therapy through BetterHelp. So be sure to use yours before they expire. You've been fighting these patterns alone for long enough. Maybe it's time someone actually helped you understand them. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month. On the night of January 12, 1964, a police sergeant named Neil Johnson entered a small apartment in Los Angeles County, California, along with a team of other officers. And basically, as soon as they walked inside this apartment, they were hit with this blast of hot air and also a just terrible smell. And very quickly, Sergeant Johnson and the others recognized where the smell was coming from, because on the couch was a man who was clearly dead and decomposing. So Sergeant Johnson and the rest of the police officers had been called here by this building's landlord. The landlord had gotten complaints from some other tenants about this awful smell coming from this specific apartment. So they'd come to check it out and, mystery solved. There was a dead person in here. And based on the information they'd already gotten from the landlord about who was renting this apartment, the police already suspected that they knew exactly who this man was. The tenant of this apartment, the sole tenant, was a 38-year-old man named Eugene Meadows. And he'd actually just moved into this apartment only 6 days ago. And on top of, living in this new apartment, Eugene also was just kind of new to the area. He'd moved here from about 8 hours away for a new job. So realistically, there was a good chance he didn't really know anybody in the area. Sergeant Johnson and a few other officers walked over to the couch to take a closer look at Eugene's body. And pretty much right away, they could tell two things. One, it was pretty clear Eugene had not died recently. He had died maybe at least a couple of days ago, so he'd been sitting here for some time. And the other thing they noticed was very clearly there was a bullet hole in the back of his head. But as Sergeant Johnson began looking around the apartment for more clues, he realized that the bullet hole really didn't make any sense. Because first of all, the whole apartment was very neat and very clean. There was no sign of a robbery or a struggle or a break-in. Plus, the landlord had told Sergeant Johnson that when he had first come to check on Eugene after the initial reports of a bad smell coming from his apartment, the landlord had found that the apartment door was locked from the inside. And also he found that all the windows were closed and locked as well, which meant if Eugene was murdered, the only way that was possible would be if the killer, after shooting Eugene, left and then locked the door behind them, which meant they would have had a key, which sort of suggested that, maybe they knew Eugene, or maybe they just took the key off of him, but, Eugene is new to the area, and so it just seems sort of like a difficult theory to come up with of who would have killed him and left the scene looking this way. But the alternative to murder, perhaps that Eugene took his own life, also didn't really seem possible. Because number one, they couldn't find a gun. There was no gun in the apartment. Certainly not a gun that was near Eugene. If he would have taken his own life, the gun should have been nearby, and it wasn't. And they searched the whole apartment. There was no gun. So Sergeant Johnson and the entire team were pretty much baffled at this point. It just didn't seem to make sense how this guy could have died. And so instead of trying to, piece it all together now, they just transferred Eugene's body to the local coroner for an autopsy, hoping that the autopsy would give them more answers and allow them to understand what happened here. However, when the coroner examined Eugene's body, things actually only got more strange, because the coroner could not find a bullet inside of Eugene's head or anywhere in his body, and there wasn't an exit wound. So imagine if you get shot, the bullet goes into you, unless there's an exit wound where that bullet can exit you, the bullet will remain inside your body. And so Eugene has one hole in his head, a hole in the back of his head, a bullet hole, no second hole, no exit wound, and no bullet inside of his body. And in addition to this one big anomaly that, there is no bullet, the coroner also noticed two other things that were strange. The first was that Eugene had something known as a calcium ridge on the back of his head near the area where there was this hole. And it's a genetic thing. Basically, there's a section of his skull that was harder, but also more brittle. This would have been something he was born with and likely basically didn't affect him in any way, but considering it was near the area where there's this hole in his head, the coroner flagged it. And then the other thing the coroner noticed is that when he looked at Eugene's internal organs, like in his abdomen, they were a very bright cherry red color. Now, at first glance, the coroner actually didn't necessarily think that the color of his organs really mattered that much. But as the coroner really just could not make sense of how Eugene actually died, he began to go back to the color of the organs, and he thought of something. And so he went to the police and he asked Sergeant Johnson to, just in case, go back to Eugene's apartment and check for this one very specific thing. If it's there, it explains this whole thing. And sure enough, Sergeant Johnson and the police, they went back to Eugene's apartment and they found the thing that the coroner suspected would be there. And it did explain the whole mystery. And it turned out what happened to Eugene was not even close to what Sergeant Johnson originally suspected. Eugene was not murdered, he was not shot in the head, nor did he take his own life. In fact, there was no shooting. He was not shot to death either by himself or by somebody else. Instead, what the coroner suspected from seeing those bright red organs is that maybe Eugene died from carbon monoxide poisoning, which can cause your organs to turn bright cherry red. And so when they went to his apartment, they discovered his heater was leaking and it was emitting poisonous carbon monoxide gas. And so the mystery of how Eugene died was solved. He died from carbon monoxide poisoning. But how he got this hole in his head is a whole other story. After Eugene passed out on his couch from this poisoning, the gas caused his brain to swell. And because he had that calcium ridge on the back of his head that he was born with, that's that harder but more brittle part of his skull, well, as his brain continued to swell, it eventually broke through that calcium ridge and basically his head exploded. His brain blew out the back of his head, giving the impression that he had been shot. One afternoon in the spring of 1998, a 64-year-old man named Klaus Schmidt walked through the international terminal of the Dublin airport in Ireland. And for some reason, as he was walking, he just felt really, really nervous. Like the idea of getting on his plane today just felt like a really bad idea. When Klaus finally spotted his gate at the end of the terminal, that feeling of almost dread really just totally washed over him. Now, Klaus generally was kind of a nervous flyer, but he never had this sort of existential dread before boarding a flight. This was new. This felt different. And so finally, when he got to the end of his terminal and actually saw his gate and saw people boarding his flight, he almost had like a panic attack. And he thought, maybe I should just listen to my gut feeling here and not board this plane and just, fly out tomorrow or something. But as he's standing there looking at the people getting on this flight, his logical side of his brain began taking over, and he just told himself that he was just being really nervous here, that there was nothing to be worried about, that he should just get on the flight, that it'll be over soon, and he was just overreacting. And so even though he really could not fully get rid of this feeling he had, this dread that was like in his stomach at this point, he kind of overrode how he was feeling walked up to the gate, scanned his ticket, and boarded the flight. About an hour later, and Klaus, he's in the aircraft, they've taken off by this point, and they're flying over the Irish Sea, and Klaus, he was by the window, he raised up the blind on his window, and he looked out, and it was, smooth sailing out there, the water's beautiful and calm down below, and he looked around at the other passengers and saw people were, relaxed. They were reading and relaxing and chatting, like there was no reason to think anything was going wrong on this flight. But still, Klaus just could not get rid of this feeling, and he just desperately wanted the plane to land and be done with this thing. But Klaus knew he couldn't speed the plane up, and so instead he just kind of did some breathing exercises and tried to calm himself down, and at first it was working. But over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, Klaus started to feel like he was having a hard time breathing. And he began looking around to see if other passengers were also struggling to breathe. Like maybe there's something wrong with the cabin pressure. Maybe there's something wrong with the air inside of the plane, but he'd look around and everybody still seems completely fine. It's just Klaus, who by this point is, he's sweating, he's rocking back and forth, he's so anxious, he just desperately wants this flight to be over. But again, it was like this inability to breathe continued to get worse and worse, and then he started to feel this really intense tightness in his chest, and he was telling himself, like, I'm having a panic attack. That's what's happening here. It's like my anxiety is fully taken over. I can't control it. And so he took off his jacket and he kind of unbuttoned his shirt, and he's like dripping sweat, and the other passengers now are starting to take notice of Klaus. Like something's going on with this guy, but no one said anything yet. And Klaus, he's trying to stay calm, but he keeps looking around and everybody else seems fine and something's going on with him. And then that tightness in his chest, it got so bad that Klaus realized that this likely was not anxiety. He could be having a heart attack. And then as soon as he realized that that likely was what was happening to him, it was like all of his symptoms got 10 times worse. And before long, he felt himself kind of fading out of consciousness. He heard other passengers near him yelling out for help, clearly about him. And then a flight attendant ran over and began yelling out to the rest of the plane, "Are there any doctors on board?" And so as Klaus is drifting further and further into unconsciousness, all he could think to himself was his intuition was right. Something bad was going to happen on this plane. But before he could think much more about it, his vision went blurry and he faded into darkness. But it would turn out that Klaus's intuition was actually only half right. Because while it was true that something terrible did happen to him on that flight, he really did have a heart attack, it actually was his decision to get on the flight that saved his life. Because this particular flight was carrying 40 heart specialists home from an international cardiology conference, and they had samples with them of a brand new heart drug that was not yet available to the public. So when Klaus had his heart attack and the flight attendant began calling out for a doctor, well, the 40 doctors all shot their hands up in the air, and one of them rushed over and literally just gave Klaus this new medication that saved his life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.